What happens when the most powerful man in the kingdom strips away his crown to beg in the freezing mud? In a world where only the strong survive, it wasn't the ruthless lords who passed the Alpha King's ultimate test, but a broken, starving Omega with a single crust of bread. The winter of 1442 hit the Ruther'n province with a brutality not seen in a generation. The snows piled high against the stone walls of the keep, and the rivers froze thick enough to support the weight of a laden warhorse. At the pinnacle of this frozen world sat Alpha King Orion Croft, a ruler known as much for his lethal prowess on the battlefield as for his rigid sense of justice. But a king secluded in his high keep hears only the whispers his lords allow to reach his ears. For months, disturbing rumors had bled through the stone walls of Orion's fortress. Whispers spoke of beta lords in the outer territories, specifically in the wealthy valley of Oakfield, hoarding the winter grain, slaughtering the deer strictly for their own tables, and leaving the lower ranks to starve. The Omegas, the most vulnerable of the pack, were said to be dying in the snowbanks, treated worse than stray dogs by the very nobility sworn to protect them. Orion demanded answers from his regional governor, Lord Cedric Harlington, but Cedric assured him with smooth words and ledgers full of forged numbers that the pack was thriving, fat, and happy. Orion did not trust parchment. He trusted his own eyes. On the eve of the winter solstice, the Alpha King made a decision that would alter the history of his reign. He dismissed his royal guard, locked the heavy oak doors of his bedchamber, and shed his velvet cloaks, his gold-hilted broadsword, and his silver crown. He dressed himself in the filthy, lice-ridden rags of a dead vagrant his spymaster had procured from the dungeon. To hide his identity, he smeared his face with a mixture of soot, mud, and the ash of crushed wolfsbane. The wolfsbane was excruciating. It burned his skin and forcefully suppressed his overwhelming alpha aura, reducing his dominant scent to the sour, weak stench of a sickly, cast-out rogue. He bound his left leg tightly with rough twine to force a permanent, agonizing limp and slipped out of the castle through a smuggler's tunnel. By the time Orion reached the borders of Oakfield 3 days later, the deception was almost too real. The wolfsbane coursing through his veins made him genuinely feverish, and the biting wind cut through his thin rags like daggers of ice. His stomach cramped with true hunger. He had not eaten since he left the keep, determined to experience the exact reality of his poorest subjects. Oakfield was a village of stark contrasts. At the center stood Lord Cedric's sprawling stone manor, its massive chimneys billowing thick gray smoke into the sky, carrying the mouth-watering scent of roasted venison, spiced wine, and fresh-baked pastries. Surrounding it were the sturdy timber homes of the betas and enforcers. But on the very fringes, pushed against the dark, predator-filled woods, were the rotting, drafty hovels of the Omegas. Orion dragged his bound leg through the knee-deep snow, approaching the heavy iron gates of Cedric's manor. The courtyard was filled with nobles wrapped in thick furs, laughing and drinking as they arrived for the solstice feast. "Please," Orion rasped, his voice rough and cracked from the cold. He reached a dirt-caked hand through the iron bars. "A scrap from your table, my lords. I have not eaten in days. The cold, it takes my breath." A high-ranking beta, a woman named Lady Rowena, paused. She was draped in a pure white fox pelt. She looked at Orion, her nose wrinkling in profound disgust. "Guards! Why is this filth permitted to dirty the air we breathe?" 2 heavily armored enforcers marched forward. One of them, a massive brute named Brannock, drove the butt of his spear into Orion's ribs. The blow cracked a bone, a sharp agony that Orion's suppressed wolf could not instantly heal. He collapsed into the freezing mud. "Get back to the woods, rogue," Brannock spat. "Lord Cedric's feast is for true wolves, not crippled beggars." Just then, the heavy oak doors of the manor opened, and Lord Cedric himself stepped out, holding a golden goblet of wine. He was a tall, handsome man with a cruel smile. Orion watched through half-closed, muddy eyes as the lord he had trusted with thousands of lives looked down at him. "A beggar at my gates on the solstice?" Cedric sneered. "It is bad luck. We cannot have him dying on the front steps. It will ruin the aesthetic of the evening." Cedric snapped his fingers. "Loose the hounds." Let them chase him back to the slums where he belongs. Orion's heart hardened to solid ice. He scrambled backward as three massive, snarling mastiffs were released. He dragged himself away, taking a vicious bite to his calf from one of the dogs before managing to throw himself over a low stone wall into a snowdrift. He lay there, bleeding, freezing, and filled with a quiet, terrifying rage. The rumors were not just true, they were an understatement. The rot in his kingdom ran deep. Night fell, bringing a deadly drop in temperature. Orion, his leg genuinely torn by the mastiff, his ribs broken, and his core temperature plummeting due to the wolfsbane suppressing his healing, was in real danger of freezing to death. He dragged himself away from the wealthy center of Oakfield, moving blindly toward the dilapidated shacks on the forest edge. In the furthest, most miserable structure, a collapsed barn with a roof patched by rotting straw, lived Alicia Mercer. Alicia was an Omega. Years ago, her family had been respected weavers, but when her father spoke out against Lord Cedric's exorbitant taxes, he was executed for treason. The Mercer lands were seized, and Alicia was reduced to the lowest caste, forbidden from working in the village, and left to survive on the frozen scraps of the forest. She was small, frail, and possessed a quiet, enduring beauty that the harsh winter had pale and hollowed. Inside her freezing barn, Alicia sat huddled by a pathetic, smoking fire made of damp twigs. Her stomach gnawed at her spine. She hadn't eaten a full meal in a week. On a wooden stump beside her rested her greatest treasure, a single, hard half-loaf of stale rye bread. She had spent 10 hours scrubbing the blood out of Lady Rowena's hunting cloaks just to earn the coin to buy it. It was supposed to keep her alive for the next 4 days. Suddenly, a heavy thud rattled the thin wooden door, followed by the sound of something dragging in the snow. Alicia jumped, her heart pounding. Wolves from the woods? A drunken enforcer coming to torment her? She grabbed a heavy wooden spindle to defend herself and slowly pushed the door open. Lying face down in the snow was a man. He was covered in mud, soot, and blood. His ragged clothes offered no protection against the killing frost, and his lips were turning a dangerous shade of blue. Alicia dropped the spindle. The strict laws of the pack were clear. Omegas were forbidden from harboring rogues or strangers under penalty of hanging. To touch him was to invite the wrath of Lord Cedric's guards. Furthermore, he was a large man. To bring him in would mean using the last of her firewood, and if he woke, he might just rob her or kill her. But Alicia was an Omega. The core of her wolf was built on empathy, nurturing, and an inherent need to care for the broken. Without a second thought for the laws or her own safety, Alicia dropped to her knees in the snow. She grabbed Orion by the shoulders of his ruined tunic and pulled. It took all of her meager strength, her boots slipping in the icy mud, but she managed to drag his heavy, unconscious body out of the wind and into the drafty barn. She kicked the door shut, barring it. Orion lay shivering violently on the dirt floor, his breathing shallow. Alicia knelt beside him. She took her only blanket, a moth-eaten wool throw, and draped it over him. She rubbed his freezing, dirt-caked hands between her own to generate friction. Orion's eyes fluttered open. Through the blur of pain and cold, he saw her. In the dim, smoky light of the fire, her pale face looked like an angel woven from winter moonlight. He could smell her scent faint beneath the smoke. It was the sweet, crisp aroma of winter jasmine and frost. It struck the deepest, most primal chord within his suppressed wolf. Mate. The word echoed in the dark cavern of his mind, though the wolfsbane kept him from acting on it. Water. Orion managed to choke out, playing the part, though the weakness in his voice was no longer an act. Hush, Alicia whispered softly, her voice a soothing melody. You are safe here. Keep still. The cold has bitten you deep. She hurried to a chipped iron pot hanging over the meager fire. Inside was a small amount of warm water. She poured it into a wooden cup and brought it to his lips, supporting his head with her gentle hand. Orion drank greedily. Then Alicia looked at the stump. She looked at her half-loaf of rye bread. Her stomach gave a violent, painful cramp. If she gave it away, she would have absolutely nothing. She would have to boil pine needles for sustenance. She walked over, picked up the hard bread, and brought it back to the fire. She broke it into small pieces, dropping them into a bowl of warm water to soften them so the broken beggar could chew them. "Here," she said, kneeling back down and lifting a soft, soaked piece of bread to his mouth. Orion stared at the bread, then up into her hollow, starving eyes. He knew what hunger looked like. He could hear her stomach rumbling. "That is all you have," he whispered. "Why do you give it to a dying rogue?" "I am nothing to you. I have nothing to give you in return." Alicia's eyes softened with a profound, quiet sadness. She gently pressed the bread to his lips. "No one is nothing," she said softly. "Even the moon shines on the mud. Eat. You need the strength to survive the night." Orion opened his mouth and accepted the bread. It tasted like ash and stale flour, but to the Alpha King, it was the greatest feast he had ever consumed. Every bite she fed him was a testament to a purity of heart he had never witnessed in his golden court. Suddenly, the harsh sound of barking dogs and heavy boots crunched outside the barn. "Sweep the slums!" a gruff voice yelled. It was Brannock, the enforcer from the gates. "Lord Cedric wants the perimeter cleared of vermin before his guests leave. Any rogues found are to be put to the sword." Alicia's face drained of color. She looked at Orion, then at the door. Panic seized her, but she did not hesitate. "Hide under the straw," she ordered, pushing him toward the back of the stall and frantically covering him with the dirty hay and her only blanket. Before she could finish, the door was kicked open, ripping off its leather hinges. Brannock stood in the doorway, a torch in one hand and a drawn sword in the other. He sneered as he looked around the pathetic hovel, his eyes landing on Alicia. "Well, well, the little Mercer Omega," Brannock sneered, stepping inside. His nose twitched. "Smells like fresh blood and wet dog in here. You hiding astray, Alicia?" "I am alone," Alicia lied, stepping between the enforcer and the pile of straw hiding the Alpha King. Her whole body trembled, but she raised her chin, her eyes flashing with defiant, protective fire. "Leave my home," Brannock laughed, a cruel, grating sound. He stepped forward and drove his heavy, mailed backhand across Alicia's face. The force of the blow sent her flying backward into the wooden wall. She crumpled to the dirt floor, blood bursting from her split lip, completely unconscious. Beneath the straw, the wolfsbane finally lost its hold against the sheer, unadulterated fury of a king watching his destined mate fall. Orion's eyes snapped open, glowing a blinding, unnatural gold in the darkness. The air in the cramped, rotting barn didn't just grow cold, it became heavy, vibrating with a frequency that made the very timber of the walls groan. Brannock, the enforcer, stood over Alicia's limp body, a cruel smirk still etched onto his face. He reached down to grab her hair, intending to drag her out into the snow as a trophy of his cleansing of the slums. But he stopped. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. A scent hit him, not the sour, sickly smell of the dying beggar, but something ancient, something that smelled of ozone, crushed pine needles, and the terrifying metallic tang of 1,000 sharpened blades. Behind him, the pile of straw exploded. Orion Croft did not rise like a man. He rose like a mountain, shifting its weight. The wolfsbane, which had been agonizingly suppressing his power, was burned away by a surge of adrenaline and protective fury so potent it scorched his veins. The rags he wore seemed to strain against a frame that was suddenly broader, taller, and radiating a heat that melted the frost on the floorboards. Brannock spun around, dropping his torch into the dirt. "What in the—" He didn't finish. Orion's hand, still caked in mud, but moving with the speed of a striking viper, clamped around Brannock's throat. The enforcer, a man who weighed nearly 300 pounds in his armor, was lifted off his feet as if he were a child's rag doll. Orion didn't shift, not fully. To shift would be too quick a death for this man. Instead, he let his alpha eyes burn through the soot on his face. They weren't just gold. They were a molten, swirling sun. "You laid a hand on her." Orion's voice was no longer a rasp. It was a low-frequency growl that rattled Brannock's teeth in his skull. "You struck a female of this pack who offered more mercy in a crumb of bread than you have shown in your entire miserable life." My lord?" Brannock wheezed, his eyes bulging as he recognized the terrifying aura of the king. Alpha. King. "Orion, please." "I didn't," Lord Cedric ordered. Lord Cedric, Orion said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a scream, is a dead man. But you are merely the first sacrifice. With a sickening crack, Orion tightened his grip. He didn't even use his claws. The sheer physical strength of the king snapped the enforcer's neck instantly. He tossed the body aside like refuse. Orion immediately turned to Alicia. The fury in his eyes vanished, replaced by an agonizing tenderness. He knelt in the dirt, his large hands trembling as he hovered them over her pale, bruised face. He reached into his core, pulling forward the healing essence that only a true alpha of the royal bloodline possessed. He pressed his thumb to her split lip. A soft, golden glow pulsed from his skin to hers. The swelling receded instantly. The skin knit back together, leaving only a faint smear of blood as a reminder of the blow. Alicia gasped, her eyes snapping open. She saw the beggar, but he was different. The soot was still there, but beneath it, the bone structure of a god was visible. His eyes were gold, a color forbidden to anyone but the High King. "You," she breathed, shrinking back in instinctive terror. The king's eyes. "You are." "I am the man you fed when he was hungry," Orion said, his voice soft, grounding her. "I am the man you protected when the wolves were at your door. Do not be afraid, Alicia. You are the only soul in this province who is truly safe tonight." He stood, offering her a hand. Alicia took it, her small, delicate fingers disappearing into his massive palm. As he pulled her up, the door to the barn creaked. 2 more guards, attracted by the silence of their leader, stepped into the light. One was a young beta named Arthur Penhaligon, the other an older man named William Graves. They saw Brannock's body. They saw the beggar holding Alicia. Arthur drew his sword, but William, who had served in the king's wars a decade ago, froze. He looked at Orion's eyes. He looked at the way the man stood, the posture of a predator who owned the very earth he walked upon. William dropped his sword. It clattered loudly on the frozen ground. He fell to his knees, pressing his forehead to the dirt. "My king, forgive us. We did not know. We were told you were in the capital." Arthur, realizing the gravity of the situation, turned pale and followed suit. Orion looked down at them, his face a mask of cold stone. "William Graves, I remember you from the siege of the Iron Pass. You were a man of honor then. Tell me, when did you trade your honor for the service of a rat like Cedric?" "The taxes, my lord," William sobbed. "Cedric threatened our families. He said if we didn't enforce his laws, our wives would be the ones starving in the street. We had no choice." "There is always a choice," Orion said, his voice ringing with authority. Alicia Mercer had nothing but a piece of stale bread, and she chose to share it. You had swords and strength, and you chose to bully the weak. He turned to Alicia, who was watching this unfold with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Alicia, go to the corner of the barn. Do not look." "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "I am going to reclaim my kingdom," Orion replied. He looked at William and Arthur. "You two will live, for now. You will carry Brannock's body to the center of the village square. You will ring the alarm bell. Tell the people, the king is here to feast. And then you will come to the manor. I have a debt to settle with Lord Cedric." The great hall of Lord Cedric's manor was a scene of decadent excess. 3 massive hogs turned on spits over the hearths. The air was thick with the scent of spiced wine and the sound of a lute played by a minstrel. Gregory Halloway, a local beta merchant, was laughing loudly at a joke Cedric had just made about the lazy Omegas who couldn't handle a bit of winter chill. Catherine Morley, a noblewoman draped in silk, sipped from a silver chalice. "Honestly, Cedric, the smell of the slums is drifting even into the hall tonight. Can't you have the guards burn those hovels down? It would be a mercy, really." Cedric chuckled, leaning back in his velvet chair. "After the solstice, Catherine. I don't want the smoke ruining the flavor of the venison." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the great hall were not opened, they were shattered. The iron hinges screamed as they were ripped from the stone, and the doors flew inward, crashing onto the long dining tables, scattering plates of gold and half-eaten food. The music stopped. The laughter died in the throats of the nobles. Into the hall stepped a nightmare. Orion Croft walked through the center of the room. He was still in his rags, his face still smeared with mud and the blood of the mastiff that had bitten him, but he no longer limped. He walked with a terrifying, rhythmic grace. Behind him, Alicia followed, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak Orion had stripped from a guard outside. "Who is this?" Cedric roared, standing up, his face purple with rage. "Guards! Kill this beggar! How dare he interrupt my feast!" The guards in the room, men like Samuel Whitaker and Edward Ross, moved forward, but they stopped 10 feet from Orion. The Alpha King didn't say a word. He simply let his aura expand. It hit the room like a physical shock wave. The candles flickered and died, leaving only the orange glow of the hearths. The nobles felt a crushing weight on their chests, an instinctive, biological need to prostrate themselves before the apex predator of their race. Samuel and Edward dropped their spears, their knees hitting the floor with a synchronized thud. Orion walked up to the high table. He looked at the feast, the meats, the fruits, the fine white bread. He reached out, picked up a loaf of bread, and looked at Cedric. "You told me the pack was thriving, Cedric," Orion said. His voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "You told me the Omegas were well fed, and the stores were full." Cedric's eyes went wide. He began to tremble. "Georion, my king, this is a misunderstanding. I was keeping the resources concentrated to ensure the survival of the strongest, for the good of the pack." "For the good of the pack?" Orion leaned over the table, his face inches from Cedric's. "I walked your streets as a beggar. I asked for a scrap at your gate. Your enforcer broke my rib. Your hounds tore my flesh. And you, Cedric, you watched it happen and called it bad luck for your aesthetic." Orion turned to the room, his eyes scanning the terrified nobles. "I found the only spark of true alpha leadership in this entire province in the one person you deemed worthless. I found it in an Omega who was starving, yet shared her last meal with a stranger." He reached back and pulled Alicia forward. She stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the people who had treated her like dirt for years. "Alicia Mercer," Orion announced, his voice booming. "Step forward." She did, her heart racing. "For your compassion, for your bravery, and for the strength of your spirit," Orion said, "I hereby strip Cedric Harlington of his title, his lands, and his life. Oakfield is no longer his." Orion looked at Cedric. "You liked the aesthetic of the cold, didn't you? Let's see how you enjoy it without your walls." With a sudden, violent movement, Orion shifted. His body tore through the rags, fur sprouting, bones popping and elongating. In seconds, a massive, midnight black wolf, standing 7 feet tall at the shoulder, stood where the beggar had been. The sheer power of the transformation blew the windows out of the hall. The king wolf let out a roar that shook the foundations of the manor. He lunged. The screams of Cedric Harlington lasted only a moment. Orion did not eat him. He simply tore the corruption from the earth. He tossed the lifeless body out into the snow, where the very dogs Cedric had used to hunt beggars began to circle. Orion shifted back, standing naked and unashamed in the firelight. Arthur Penhaligon quickly rushed forward, offering the king a heavy royal cloak of crimson wool. Orion wrapped the cloak around himself, but then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He took the silver signet ring from his own finger, the symbol of the Croft bloodline, and he knelt, not before a god, but before Alicia. "Alicia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved a king when he was a beggar. Now, I ask you to save a kingdom. My pack has lost its way. It has forgotten that strength is meant to protect, not to oppress. I cannot fix this alone. I need a queen who knows the value of a single crust of bread." The room was silent. Alicia looked at the ring, then at the man who had gone through hell just to see the truth of his people. She saw the scars on his chest, the soot on his brow, and the absolute devotion in his golden eyes. "I am just an Omega," she whispered. "No," Orion said, standing up and sliding the ring onto her finger. It was far too large, but as it touched her skin, the magic of the pack bond recognized her. The metal shrunk, fitting her perfectly, and a warmth spread through her chest, the bond of the Luna. You are the heart of this pack, and as long as I draw breath, no one will ever go hungry in Oakfield again. Orion turned to the nobles, who were still cowering on the floor. The feast is over. Samuel, Edward, clear the tables. Take every scrap of food in this manner and distribute it to the slums. Now, Arthur, William, you will oversee the transition. Any noble who protests will answer to my claws. As the hall erupted into a flurry of terrified activity, Orion turned back to Alicia. He picked her up in his arms, carrying her toward the high throne at the head of the table. "Are you still hungry?" he asked softly. Alicia looked at the bread on the table, then back at him, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. I think I've had enough bread to last a lifetime, my king." "Good," Orion whispered, kissing her brow. "Because tomorrow we feast on justice." The winter of 1442 was remembered not for its cruelty, but for the king's mercy. Orion and Alicia ruled for 50 years, transforming the Ruther'n province into a sanctuary where the strongest were the ones who gave the most. And the legend of the Beggar King and the Bread Giver was told for generations, a reminder that the truest power isn't found in a crown, but in the heart of those who have nothing, yet give everything. The Alpha King's test revealed the rot in the heart of power, proving that true royalty is found in mercy, not gold. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and forbidden romance, don't let the fire die out. Hit that like button, share this story with your pack, and subscribe to our channel for more legendary tales of the Alpha King. Your support keeps the stories howling. Thank you for listening.